Good morning, fellas. All right. I know you guys are on the coffee this morning. It's buzzing in here. Let's get started. All righty, we are in our study. What is a man? And as soon as you guys can work this in, we'll get started. What is a man? We're in week 7, and we're going through and we're looking at highlights, moving quite quickly in relation to where we were in one man's journey. Just looking at some high spots in the life of Jacob before we move on to what we're going to be doing next. But I wanted to capture some of the key times in Jacob's life, and then correlating them to our own experience, of which we've been doing our table times. But we have finished the first part of Jacob's life, the ascent, first half of Jacob's life, and this morning we're going to introduce the next section, which is really interesting to me. It's a crossover. Notice the text here, crossing over from the first half of life to the second half of life. And of course you're thinking, gee, what factors are involved in that? And that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to introduce two key terms that really are imperative, I would call imperative, in moving from the first half of life to the second. And notice just by my comments, it's not our age that determines moving into what is true of the second half of life. Somewhat our age, but it's much more about what we've allowed to happen to us in order to move into this second half of life. Chapter 31 bridges this movement. And we'll be looking at quite a few texts in chapter 31. It's a key chapter, but this morning we're just going to focus in on one verse. But notice how chapter 31 straddles first half and second half, and then we'll be looking at that. Now, before we do, last week we took a survey, and we wrapping up the first half of life. Which of the following terms best describe your ascent experience? And so we took that survey on the polls and with our phones and so forth. And this is the data that we captured. Notice I had just lots of, I don't know how many terms there, but they're all over the map. They're like just a hodgepodge of different terms that we have looked at during our study in the ascent. We've introduced these ideas, and then you guys responded. And what I did is I took that response and I put it onto a pie chart of really some key ideas that would profile our group here at the Mood House. And so what you guys said is based on last week's poll. The largest category was 51% of us feel that we had a safe, affirming, plenty environment. We had a good what we would call conventional upbringings. What that means in most of our cases is that mom and dad were both at home. We had siblings. We had plenty to eat. We had parents who loved us. We had a safe environment. There was some level of affirmation, and that's primarily what our profile as a group, that's what you guys stated. The next largest category, and again, I was grouping these and I put these together. So 37% of the responses were a positive sense of the future. So this has bearing on this, that there was a sense, and I think it really reflected the culture of the time. I felt outside of what was happening in Vietnam. I remember when the Vietnam War ended, I believe it was 1973, there was really a sense of relief. I remember. Many of you, a little bit older than me, were caught up with the draft. The draft was abolished the year before I turned 18, so didn't really deal with that. But there was some uncertainty. But overall, I don't know what you guys would think, but I would think the future was positive. We were looking for a positive future. And you guys reflected that 37% of your responses protected pretty, at this time of ascent, pretty positive. There were 12% of us that had, we introduced this term deficit, and using Esau as an example of a young man who really started out with a lot of baggage, but yet later on in life he overcame those things. And how he did it, we had quite a discussion about that. And 12% of us were in that category of deficit, that we didn't get, we didn't have this as a young person, and there was a lot to overcome. So, my applause to you guys, and I would say the grace of God being active in your lives, we would have to attribute that ability to overcome that. Why some and not the other? That's a question beyond what we can discuss this morning. But I think everyone in this room is pretty well adjusted. I know we all got our stuff, but by golly, God has done a marvelous thing in our lives. Yes.
An observation, I thought of that, and I was thinking that I think many of us are that way, but I can't speak for everybody. But I took that thing real well. I had a safe, affirming, and plenty environment. And that was provided for because my dad was around and my dad was working. Now, the price of that was Dad was gone a lot. Dad wasn't that involved personally in my life. Dad was involved in the businessmen, the relationship, the Elks Club, these things.
Right. Yeah.
So it's an interesting, might have been a slight trade-off. If my dad had been a little more active and involved in my life, things may have been different to me, but then maybe it would have lost some of that security. I don't know, but there was a price in my lives. There was a certain benefit to that, but there's a price that we paid for that.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you're stating is probably true of a lot of us. Our dads were non-expressive, but generally speaking, right. I've surveyed lots of men in groups, and I asked them, how many of you definitively can remember your dad looking you in the eye and grabbing you eyeball to eyeball and saying, "Son, I love you." That's rare. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now today, if we were to survey the current population with small children, now we've got the parents that are really, really engaged. And it's probably much more common for parents to tell their sons and daughters that they love them than we did. Now there's some other ramifications of that, not that specifically. That's a good thing, but that goes beyond what we can talk about this morning. But this whole idea of just what level of engagement, we tend to move from this way to this way, and that's just part of our nature, I guess. So, well, moving on. Here's our master chart, and we've looked at this ascent, and then there's a crossing over. There's a line. I see it. Now, again, this is out of my head, guys, so bear with me. But I'm not alone. I read a lot and get input. But there's these two halves of life, and they really represent, they're two separate ideas. This is all about acquiring and building and becoming and this kind of thing. But and that's really where our culture value is it still is here. But the realities of life sooner or later push in on us, and they cause us, or at least to raise our attention to really a much more profound level of living, which is available to us, I believe, through the gift of what Christ has provided in this second half of life. And that's where we're looking at today, is that crossover point. What is it that causes us to finally cross over? Now there's some images. I zoomed in on this. We're going to look at this for a few weeks, and I know there's a line going here and there's a line going here. We're going to talk more about that. But right now, today, we're looking at what causes us to move from this first half to second half of life. This big question mark, and that's what we're going to look at. What causes this crossover? That's what we're going to look at this morning. So someone could read. We're going to be looking at group 4 snapshots out of Genesis 31. All of the snapshots. We're just going to look at one this morning of the grouping, and that's the first one. And I want to look at this crossover point first, and then we're going to fill in the leading up to that, and then the post of that crossing over in the next weeks. But let's just look at Genesis 31:31. If someone could read that verse.
And Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I said, peradventure you would take by force your daughters from me.
Okay, is that the end of the verse?
Yep.
Okay, I couldn't remember what was adding, but okay, we're really pulling this verse out. But the story behind this verse is that there is Jacob and his family. He's raised his family. He now has 2 wives. He's been successful in Haran. He's overcome and worked through the whole thing of the wife swap, and he's lived a bulk of his life. And there is jealousy in the ranks. There's jealousy in the family. And Jacob starts to get nervous. And then the Lord speaks to him in chapter 31 and says, go back home. It's time to go back home. Well, that was part of the vision and mission in the first place. God, clear back in Bethel, when he was leaving as a young man, God said, you're going to return back to this land. And so it was a confirmation of that. And through a whole series of events that we'll look at more closely, he decides to basically flee away rather than facing his father-in-law and being upfront about the whole thing. He decides to pack up and leave in the night. And unbeknownst to him, Rachel stole the gods, the family gods, these little icons. And so Laban wakes up in the morning and the family's gone and his gods are gone. And so he's in active pursuit and finally overtakes Jacob at some point and the family. And here at this point, this juncture, Jacob expresses to his father-in-law his own fear. And I look at that as a profound demonstration in Jacob's life, admitting fear. And he's able to articulate why he was running away. So that's what we're going to look at. And there are 2 key factors in this verse. We're going to focus in on this verse. For Jacob to admit to his father, all people, his father-in-law, did Jacob have reason to fear his father-in-law? Yes, of course. History bears it out. His father-in-law tricked him, deceived him, did the wife swap. Laban, there's good data here. There's good reason that Jacob would not trust his father-in-law in this story. And but for Jacob to admit to this man his fear, I look at this again as a profound doing in his life. Jacob first had to become aware that he was afraid. Now I'm switching into my belief about life and about us as what we would call fallen human beings. That our actions, guys, our actions are motivated by a deep, I would say even subconscious subconscious actions that are going on in our lives, we are acting out in ways prior to becoming aware of why we are acting out the way we are. In other words, the people around us, primarily our loved ones, are very aware of our baggage before we become aware of our baggage. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I was, yeah, I mean, this is a default fact of human life, the way again, from my head, that we slowly become aware. And becoming aware means becoming more awake. We become more awake in life, how my actions are affecting those around me. That is not just something that is apparent to us. I was down last weekend with my daughter, and Annie's doing great, Dave. Yeah, it's really, really good. And Bob. She lives in between Gunnison and Montrose, and when Dad visits, part of the there's always stuff to do, which is cool. I was working on 2 snowmobiles. You know, now there's no snow down there now, but we're getting them ready for next winter. There was some mechanical stuff that we had to do, so I was working on them, and she was out helping me, and I was trying to teach her a few things about things that she could do. Well, Annie is my daughter, and it's really easy for me to, Annie, would you do this, and let's check this, and let's check this. And all of a sudden I caught myself and I said, am I being too bossy? And she says, not yet. And I thought, okay, well, see, there was a time in my life I wouldn't have been aware of that. That, I am a guest in her home. Yes, I'm her dad, but I'm also her guest. I'm working on her equipment. Back off a little bit, Dad. And so I'm grateful for what God has showed me about me. But I was not always aware of that. And so that is something desirable to become aware. And notice how I've got 1 through 10 here, a scale, and this represents our ability to become awake. And there was a time in Jacob's life that he became aware that he was afraid. He was acting out of fear before he was aware of being afraid. I've got another story. Christ in the Rockies. We were on a bicycle trip. One of our I may have shared this story. Quality man, 62 years old, this fella from Texas, and great guy, great family. But he and his son, they were having a lot of difficulty, and I won't go into what that read, but a lot of conflict. And on the trip, there was conflict. His son was second year in college, so his son was probably 19, 20 years old. And they were having some real difficulty. So I rode with this man. I got to ride. We spent a whole day biking together, and I spent the day listening, and primarily listening. And he asked my advice on a few things, and I gave it. But the last night when we finished up the camp, we stayed in a hotel in Salida and went out for a nice dinner to celebrate the trip and all that. And walking back to the van, this fella pulled me aside and just said, "Hey, can I talk to you for a minute?" Yeah. And he said, I want you to know that on this trip, I became aware that I have lived most of my life in fear. And it was really, this trip was, he went on to say how eye-opening it was for him. It takes a while, and that's why this is so profound, that Jacob at this point in life, he's not perfect. He's not acting. It would have been a lot better to face the music, and say the goodbyes and all that, but he didn't. He chose to flee But when he was confronted by his father-in-law, he was able to state why he fled, which is amazing to me. And that shows a high degree of awareness. He became aware of his actions. Okay, so that's number one. Now that awareness is something we all would like. We would like to know how our actions affect those around us. We would like that. I look at this as a direct correlation to transformation in Christ. Is that as we become aware, we then have the power through the Holy Spirit to act differently. So this is good. We want to move up to a 10, but it's a process. Okay, number 2 then in the text, verse 31 is he became aware that he was afraid, so that gave him the power to then explore why I'm afraid. That's the next question. Okay, if I'm afraid and my actions have been out of fear for so long, what is it that I was afraid? And we know that from the text because he states that to his father-in-law. And he was saying, I was afraid that you would come and by force take your daughters away from me. Did he have reason to believe that? Absolutely. I mean, the data shows that Laban could do that. It wasn't something he manufactured in his mind. It was true in his mind. So that he was able to explore the why he was afraid. This, guys, is a wonderful gift. And this gift should always be exercised, I believe, in a community of men. This is why friendship is so critical to men. Most of us are isolated, and we don't have other brothers to be able to process this kind of stuff with at this level. We're pretty private. I think the males in general are not. We're just very general, but it's something that we have to work through how to express our weaknesses and our questions and our vulnerabilities. Is very difficult for us males. Much women are much better at this, but to be able to process this with a close friend is an extreme gift. First of all, he became aware, and then he's able to ask. Once he's aware, he's able to ask, "Gee, why do I keep shooting myself in the foot here?" So. I didn't know that was going to do that. I didn't know that was going to do that. So then the next piece, notice the way I've got this drawn is, yes, awareness is one idea that's desirable. We'd like to move over here. But guys, I believe, again, this is talking from me, I believe there's a counterforce because of our condition as human beings working against that. These two forces are working against each other, and that force is control. I don't want to give up control. I like it. We would never state it that way. But there is a dynamic that works within us, is that flat out, I don't want to give up control. I want to call the shots. For a person to say, well, I'm just wired this way. Okay, that's helpful in one regard, but it's very unhelpful in another regard. Well, you just have to accept me the way I am. Well, okay, you can just keep going through life and keep making the same, shooting yourself in the foot over and over again. Yes, there is a certain personality, there are personality types and so forth. But guys, part of our calling as men and as mature men is to learn how to work in a synergistic way with other people, and it's the issue of control, not wanting to give it up. This is the way I see it, and I see it this way. Well, okay, and just keep going through life that way. But as we're able to give up that control, we start to see movement. And notice this graph is going this way. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, it's darker over here. When I'm up close, I can't see it. Do you see how I have it kind of in degrees of grayness? That most control is here. Most control is here, and that's why I have little awareness, because I'm still in control. As I start releasing control and moving this way, my awareness increases. And so here's where the two ideas go together, is that awareness and control and the relationship. Now, I've got a third line down here. It says, Jacob, once he's able to explore why he's afraid, but then he needed the capacity to be able to admit it. This is the wisdom of God in the scriptures. It says, confess your faults one to another and pray for another that you be healed. All of this should be processed, guys, in a community, in a small, in relationship with other peers. This is where this happens. And there is power in confession with other brothers. And not that there's this whole word of accountability. Yes, that I like that word, but it's not to give report and do my duty to get through this confession that hopefully something good. It's about being vulnerable and transparent with one another, and then at that time, then we can call each other up. We can empathize and call each other up. Do you understand that? You know, when another text I really that has bearing on this is when Jesus died on the cross. He said, "Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing." In other words, they didn't know what they didn't know. Their awareness was way down here. And that is the default mode, in my opinion, of the human being. The transforming power of the Holy Spirit is that as we give up control, we become more aware. We just become more aware of what things are. I mean, we can walk around life and be in very little of awareness of the true reality of what's happening. That's the point.
I love where you're going with this. I would introduce coming back to the Reverend and his wedding message. I would introduce the concept of love, along with the accountability and the interchange in the relationship. The Bible says perfect love casts out fear. And oftentimes I think the only way that we can get in touch with our fears and admit and so on is when we are in a relationship or relationships of love. That's I think where we grow, where our awareness increases.
I couldn't agree more. We tend to think in our evangelical, and again, guys, this is a very general thing, but it's me and God, my relationship with God. Well, it just so happens that God is active in the relationships around us, and God can speak in and through people. The script, I think we could go on and on. The scriptures would bear that out. That piece. The reason we're not in relationship is I think one primary reason is because we want to maintain control. I don't want to be vulnerable. But when we are, there is a love that can be expressed that can actually empower us to raise the bar, to be able to move on. So this capacity here is a key word. He had to have the capacity to admit, because that is not a normal, that's not an easy thing for us men, and I would say anybody. But if he's this tells me that he's moved along here, and he has that capacity to admit. And let me move on. So the way the two work together. Oh, there's that arrow again. Yeah, gee, isn't that cool? I just did not know I did that. So the two. This is kind of a chicken and egg question. How do these two work? And what the second half of life is about, guys, is releasing control. This is what the second half of life is about, is the ability to release control and watch what happens. Letting go. And it's a chicken and egg kind of thing. And this is why this verse is where I see Jacob has crossed over, because he's releasing control. Now we're going to look at the text around it, and it'll be kind of peppered with some other interesting things. But the key verse here is 31. He admits his fear, and he admits why. Yes?
2 points, neither of them is salient, is the one about love. The context of the verse would indicate that Jacob expressed this not only to his father-in-law, to Laban, but with his family present.
Oh, good.
Now, as guys, if you can think about that for a minute, it's one thing to have a confrontation of some sort with an individual.
Right.
It's another thing to open yourself up to the observations of all kinds of other people that you're also related to, that you might not want them to be aware of your, whatever. The other thing is, there's an excellent book, you were talking before about some of the differences between the way us guys deal with these issues versus, there's a book called Women Are From Venus, Men Are From Mars. And if you haven't ever read that book, it's a real good resource for understanding how we are different from our brides and from women, and the way that we, and it really is, in a sense, having read the book a couple of times, I think it speaks to, in a context, the way God has wired men and women differently, emotionally. I don't want to say spiritually, because I think in essence spiritually we're the same, but it gives some real good insight about why does she do that way? Why does he do that?
Well, great insight, Dave. That's really true, because again, not wanting certain people's here, that's control.
That's control.
Yeah. And what the gospel teaches us, the example through Christ, is that through letting go, the ultimate letting go of his life, there was resurrection. And that is the key idea. As we learn to let go, we can experience resurrection. But boy, that letting go is tough. And what shows me in Jacob's life that he's moved on, he's crossed over, is his, in a very humbling situation with his father-in-law and with the other family members around. He says, I was afraid. I was afraid that you would come and take your daughters away. It's certainly understandable, but for him to be able to admit that is a profound working within him and moving on. So, how the two relate, and this is the two key ideas that I'd like you to think about. Well, you know, that's up to you, but is this idea of control and awareness and how the interplay works between the two. Capacity increases as need for control decreases. As I'm able to release control, I receive a larger capacity. And again, this is all tied back to faith. My faith that if I let go, someone is going to be there to catch me, and that's Christ. So capacity increases as my need for control decreases. And finally, as need for control decreases, awareness increases. Do you see how that works together? And again, chicken and egg. I think the key idea here is control. Is I am able to release control, good things happen. Good things happen in me and in my relationships around me. Yes?
Paul said, I mean, Christ, I'm butchering it, but Christ's power is revealed in my weakness. So when I'm weak,
there you
I'm
go.
strong.
There you go. That's the same. It's the same idea. And Paul just didn't figure that out, over a quiet time. It took years for him to work that out.
He had to get knocked off his ass first.